Okay, so our very first online lecture. Apologies in advance if this is a little rough. We'll just do the best we can. All right, so as you can see, the topic of today's lecture is the Age of Exploration, and we are talking about European exploration. We're going to be backing up a tiny bit in time, so just take note of that. Where last we left off in lecture, we were talking about the 30 Years' War. We'd gotten all the way to 1648 and the end of that, and so just take a note of the date. We are at 1415, so we've backed up a few centuries. This is before Martin Luther. This is before Columbus. This is before the Reconquista of Spain. It's before all of that jazz. So we're talking about the very sort of beginnings of the Age of Exploration, as we might call it. And where we can find that first, you could say, is in Portugal's exploration of the coast of Africa. And they begin quite modestly with a little fort that they establish. And it looks pretty much like the picture you see here. Quite heavily fortified, not especially large in terms of territory. It's really just an outpost, a leapfrog point on the coast of Morocco. And the purpose of this fort and a bunch of others they're going to found after it is really to put a place that is secure, that they can refuel ships, that they could then use as a base to go further down. And so the first of these is the Portuguese city of Ceuta, where they set up this fortress to be a base where they can further explore. One of the great proponents of this exploration movement is this guy up here on the left, Prince Henry the Navigator. He's the younger son of the King of Portugal, John I, and he is really strongly in favor of exploration, of investment in the types of ships that are capable of long-range voyages. The Caravel, you see this one here, is the most famous of these Portuguese ships. They're a little different from the other types of merchant vessels we see in the 1400s because they have a deeper hull, or sort of belly of the ship. They can hold more supplies, more water, and that is the most important supply for an exploratory ship. They can hold more water, more supplies. They also have a very deep keel. They're hard to flip over even in high seas. These are ships that are designed for long voyages, large cargoes, and deep water sailing. And that's probably the most important piece of technology that's going to contribute to making this age of exploration possible. If you can see here in the center, this is a picture of an astrolabe. Astrolabe technology is something that was brought back to Europe after the Crusades, yet again a crusade tie-in, and it's basically a very complicated mathematical chart and map. You can use it to determine your latitude, you can use it to determine all kinds of things, but you can use the stars, you can use the position of the sun, you can use the position of the moon in some cases. There's various plates that kind of go in and out. It's a relatively complicated piece, but what it makes possible is it makes possible something called blue water sailing. Sailing and navigating away from the site of the coast. Even though the Portuguese are going to mostly hug the coast of Africa in their exploratory ventures at first, at least in the 1400s, nevertheless, things like the astrolabe are going to make it possible for people to sail more direct routes out of sight of land, and it's going to be very important. Henry the Navigator is going to get the funding, at least some of the funding, for his voyages, for this exploratory endeavor that he really promotes and is going to spearhead, in part because he is the Grand Master of the Order of Christ in Portugal. The Order of Christ it's difficult to explain, but the Order of Christ is what's left, in many ways, of the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar, if you remember, were those warrior monks in the Crusades who invent banking. They ultimately are disbanded by the Pope, and there's an attempt to arrest them in France, and many of them flee and are going to found other orders of monks in countries like Portugal, in countries like Spain, in countries like Scotland. They kind of scatter and go all over the place. And there are a whole bunch of conspiracy theories that spring up centuries later. If you ever read a Dan Brown novel, you'll get some of these, about these kind of secret underground Templars that go on to orchestrate the I guess, the decisions that change the world and are running world affairs secretly behind closed doors. It's all very silly. But part of what feeds those rumors are connections like this, where Henry the Navigator is getting the money for his exploration of the coast of Africa from these remnants of the Knights Templar, and he's going to use that to really change the direction of European history. Okay, now there's a strong motivation for Portugal and then ultimately Spain and the rest of Western Europe as well to begin this type of exploration. The practical reason has to do with the Ottoman expansion and conquest along the coast of the Mediterranean. By the middle of the 1400s, the Ottomans were controlling a great deal of the territory that was the sort of depot, the exchange place where the silk and spice roads of Asia ended up in the Mediterranean, and then those goods were originally, or at least in the few centuries before, moved by mostly Italian merchants and traders through the Mediterranean, perhaps through the Straits of Gibraltar and out to northern Europe that way, but also along the southern coast to move goods and sell them at a great profit. Well, now, the only way to do that was to pay serious protection money and tariffs to the Ottomans. Their corsairs were effectively working the Mediterranean, making sure that anybody who wanted to take part in this trade had to pay through the nose. And so for that reason, in Spain and Portugal, there was a strong desire to see if they could circumvent this Mediterranean trade and get out and try to find a different route to India. And arguably China eventually as well, but India was the first goal. So that is why they begin exploring, Portuguese, right here, begin exploring just along the coast of Africa, setting up those little leapfrog points to see if they can find a route around. Now, they really didn't know whether it was possible or not. And they're guided in part, as I mentioned before, by this practical desire to find a cheaper way to India, because sea voyages were in fact much, much cheaper than any kind of attempt at travel over land, which would still have taken them through Ottoman territory. But also, they're motivated, and this is just a curiosity more than anything else, by some very fanciful impulses as well. Henry the Navigator, him again, had as his personal kind of obsession a legend that became popular around the 1200s in Europe. It was a legend called Prester John. And the story went that there was this lost kingdom somewhere, and it was ruled, the thought was that it was in Africa someplace, and it was ruled by this guy named Prester John. And he was a Christian, and he just lived someplace in Africa, and his kingdom was something like Shangri-La, where there was no sickness and no war, and everything was great, and everyone was rich, and the streets were paved with gold. And it was just this idyllic, perfect place, and this fabulous lost kingdom someplace that nobody knew quite where it was. And Henry the Navigator, among others, was obsessed with this story. He really thought that it must exist someplace. And one of his goals in promoting the exploration of Africa was, or at least Africa's coast, was to try to find the fabulous kingdom of Prester John. And here you can see there's a map that was drawn up by somebody who was trying to use process of elimination for this. So you can see the Arabian Peninsula it's not quite to scale, but you can see the coastline is fairly accurate. You can see Ethiopia, Mauritania, all of those beautiful places. You can see the line of Africa's coast looks actually fairly similar to how it looks. The shape of the continent is quite squished because people's sense of distance was not as strong as it could be, and so they don't have quite as clear an idea as they should how big Africa is. But if you can see this map, if you look at it closely, it says down in the corner, the Kingdom of Prester John, and they're trying to use process of elimination. Everywhere that they've explored, they're like, well, this is that, and this is here, so what's left over clearly must be the Kingdom of Prester John. It was quite an amusing sort of way to look at the world. Okay. Back to practicalities. As the Portuguese began exploring, as I mentioned, they're setting up these little hopscotch outposts, these small forts. They don't invade or explore very far inland at all. Instead, they just set up fortified areas, try to trade with any locals that they encounter, and to just set them up as places where you can refuel, restock ships, and go a little further and a little further and a little further each time down along the coast. It's going to take years and years from the establishment of Ceuta until the Portuguese are going to actually make it around the coast of Africa. And as they're working on this, it's quite expensive, it's quite labor intensive, they're investing a lot, and they're anxious that they don't lose this investment. And so they apply. They're not sure who they should apply to in these matters, so it seems logical enough that they would ask the Pope. In this case, it's Nicholas V, you can see him there. And they ask him for his sort of legal guarantee. Now, there's no precedent for this. He doesn't really have any legal jurisdiction here, but he asks, and well, they ask, and he agrees. And what they ask him for is to guarantee that all the new territory that they uncover, all this work they're putting in, this trade route will belong to Portugal as a monopoly. The Spanish or the English or the French or anybody else can't just come swooping in after them and grab up this sort of trade route that they establish and use it for themselves. So the Pope gets this request, will you guarantee a monopoly? And he's like, sure, okay. And so he writes it off, and basically it becomes his sort of papal edict that says that these newly discovered lands, as he would say, it is, of course, goes without saying that it's not really a newly discovered land if it's full of people, but there you have it. But these newly discovered lands would be exclusively the province of Portugal. He also, in this same document, gives permission to Portugal. They're not going to be using it extensively for a while yet, but he gives permission to Portugal to purchase and trade in slaves in these lands, as long as, and this is an important proviso, those slaves are not Christian. As long as the people they encounter are not Christian, then the Pope says it's okay to enslave them and to trade in slaves that have been captured. Okay, so decades pass, as I mentioned, from the 1415 capture of Ceuta. In 1488, Bartolomeo Diaz is going to round the Cape of Good Hope. That's the southern tip of Africa. And as he gets around to the other side, it becomes clear he's done it. There is an end to this enormous, and Africa is enormous continent. And it is going to be possible, yay, to get to India this way. So he returns back to Portugal. Everyone is super excited in Portugal. Everyone who's not in Portugal becomes super concerned because it seems clear Portugal's going to have a monopoly on a new sea route to India in short order. And so places like Spain it really become concerned. They're like, hey, we're going to fall behind in this. England is still fairly much a backwater, but they are also, concerned and interested. They're like, hey, we want to be left out of this. France, same thing. So there's some pressure on the rest of Europe. Can we keep up with Portugal? Now, they can't just do the same thing Portugal's doing, explore the coast of Africa, because Portugal already has a monopoly on that. So, what are they going to do? Well, in 1492, Spain decides to pull just a kind of a long shot. Isabella and Ferdinand have combined Castile and Aragon. They've completed the Reconquista in Spain, as they call it, where they've conquered all of the territory back, as they see it, at least, and consolidated into a single Spain. And they celebrate this in part by what we've already discussed, the Alhambra Decree, where they're going to banish all Jewish people from Spain. They also celebrate by giving Columbus a commission to try to reach India by sailing across the Atlantic. Now, this is a crazy idea. Not because people thought the world was flat. They certainly did not. Everyone who was educated knew that the world was round. Most educated people had a far better sense of how big the world is, however. And Columbus really thought that he could sail across the Atlantic and just keep going west until he hits India. Sort of, I guess that would be possible if the continents of North and South America were not in the way, but if he had not hit the continents of North and South America and had to sail the entire distance, he and his ships would certainly have been lost. They would have died of starvation and died of lack of water long before they ever made it there. So he's very lucky that he was wrong. But he's going to insist, intriguingly enough, his entire life that he was correct, because he sails from Spain. hits the Canary Islands, travels to the west, and he's going to land in the Caribbean. He's going to hit the island of Hispaniola, Cuba, some of the Bahamas. It's not entirely clear exactly which islands he lands on first, but he's going to land. He's going to encounter people, the Taino people, the Arawak people, who are very friendly and very kind, unfortunately for them. And they're going to help him and help him resupply, and he's going to kidnap a bunch of them, put them back on his ship, and sail back to Europe, where he reports gleefully that he has found the Indies. He's going to insist to the end of his life that he found some unknown part of India. These are islands that belong to the Indies somehow. For this reason, this region in the Caribbean is sometimes referred to as the West Indies. Columbus is, of course, completely wrong. Even he sort of knows by the end of his life that he's wrong, though he'll never admit it. Everybody else in Europe immediately knows that he's wrong. When he gets back, they are absolutely thrilled and excited and interested, but they absolutely do know that this couldn't possibly be the Indies. Now, before Columbus sailed, the notion of what was to the west of Europe and Africa was really quite cloudy. As you can see from this map, maybe you can't make it out all that well, but if you can see the sort of the coast of Europe here and the coast of Africa there, there's some lovely little illustrations and drawings. Over to the west, they really just kind of have no idea. They just have this kind of sense of the celestial spheres. After Columbus gets back, there's an immediate reshuffling of understanding as to what might be there. Of course, he is, sorry about that. Of course, he is going to come back with a whole bunch of people that he has, for lack of a better word, kidnapped, just kind of stolen and taken hostage and prisoner off the islands where he lands at first. And he's going to present them in the courts of Europe as evidence of where he's been and what he's seen. Now, in Europe, Spain and Portugal, of course, know immediately that Columbus has not found the Indies. They do know he's found something, however, and they're going to jump, especially Spain, as fast as possible on trying to draw up some legal protection for this new area of the world that they want to claim exclusive rights to for themselves. So they sit down with Portugal and draft the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, only 2 years after Columbus departs for his first voyage. They are going to sit down and hash out a treaty arrangement. They do it so hastily that they draw a line of longitude that is supposed to divide territory that will be the exclusive province of the Portuguese, Africa, and its kind of coastal exploration areas, from areas that should belong exclusively to the Spanish. It was meant to include all of this new West Indies stuff, as they called it. But they draw this line of longitude without really having done any serious exploration of the territory that they're claiming. And as a result of that, they draw a line that doesn't take into account how far Brazil sticks out to the east. And so just by chance, as it turns out, the line that they draw in the Treaty of Tordesillas is going to bisect South America. So if you've ever wondered why one of the official languages in Brazil is Portuguese, whereas in most other South American countries, one of the official languages is Spanish, the reason for that has to do with this arbitrary line drawn on a map in 1494 by people who didn't have any idea what it was they were claiming, because the exploration of the coast hadn't even happened yet. That's how hastily they were trying to rush to grab up as much and make as many claims as they possibly can. So, in that spirit, from there, the pressure to explore is going to be even more intense. In 1498, Vasco da Gama is going to do what the Portuguese have been trying to do for nearly a century at this point. He's going to make it all the way to India, the real India this time, the place where all those spices that Europe wanted really are. And he's going to return triumphant, having established a new trade route. So the pressure is really on. Spain has been exploring and are going to begin and continue to explore as fast as they possibly can to see whether they can find some way to turn these Western territories into cash, into money, or into, ideally, a route to the actual Indies and to China, if possible. Portugal, on the other hand, has successfully navigated their way around the coast of Africa, and they are opening up a trade route as we speak. So, part of this desperate desire of the Spanish to figure out how they can turn their newly discovered, to them, territory into cash, they begin launching expedition after expedition after expedition with royal approval, spearheaded by people known as conquistadors or conquerors. They are really these kinds of soldier of fortune, if you will, for lack of a better word, explorers. A lot of them are the same type of people who went on the Crusades back in the day. They're younger sons of nobility, people who have a kind of privileged upbringing but aren't in the way to inherit much. They're looking for a chance to make their fortune and to enrich themselves and possibly find new lands that they can grab up for themselves and settle and turn into money. And so you have a wave of these explorers/conquerors that are being launched out of Spain to find out what it is they've laid claim to and figure out how to turn it into cash as fast as possible. The other goal, of course, is to try to find a way around the continents of North and South America so that that trade route to China and India can be opened up and capitalized on. So there's a strong desire to do this. One of the conquistadors in 1513, a guy named Balboa, is going to land in Panama. He's going to conquer a whole slew of territory by basically brutalizing all the people he encounters. He's also, I guess not too coincidentally, going to make it across the Isthmus of Panama, which is very, very narrow, and encounter the sea on the other side. And when he does this, he finds enormous, enormous reassurance in it, because he, as he sees it, the South Sea, it's evidence that there is another side to this continent. It's not just enormously huge, and it's going to be possible somehow, he's convinced, to get through or around or something to navigate through here and find a workable route to the Indies and to China to make some serious dough. So very shortly after Balboa, a massive expedition is launched, spearheaded by Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan's goal is to circumnavigate the globe. So I just want to emphasize, it has not been, it was 1492, Columbus sailed. By 1519, they're sending out a guy to try to get all the way around the globe, to do what Columbus kind of always thought he'd done, but clearly had not, and get to India through a sea route. Magellan is going to take off. He's going to explore down the coast of South America. He's going to get to the bottom, the Straits of Magellan as it comes to be known. This is a really difficult and dangerous crossing. Around the Cape of Good Hope is kind of rough enough in terms of the seas, but around the southern bit of South America, I don't know if you can quite make out on this map, but South America's southern coast comes very, very close to Antarctica. It's really far south and it's really cold, and the weather is notoriously horrifying through there. It's very dangerous. But he is going to make it around the coast, the southern bit of South America. He's going to make it through and into the actual Pacific Ocean, and then into the Indian Ocean ultimately. He himself is going to die in the Philippines, but his ships, the voyage itself, is going to be successful. They're going to make it all the way back to Europe and report that it is in fact possible to circumnavigate the globe. All this whole time, enormous leaps and bounds forward have been made in navigational technology, in shipbuilding, in equipment, in the number, a sheer amount of money that's being invested in shipping and exploration. It has become a major international race to try to capitalize on new routes, to establish trade partners, and to capitalize on new territories that could potentially be lucrative. One of the people who most infamously is launched out of Spain to try to capitalize on these new territories is a guy named Hernan Cortez. Cortez is one of those conquistadors. He's going to end up in central Mexico. He finds what many of the conquistadors are actively looking for. What they actively seek are large, or at least large-ish, regional empires, places where native peoples have already established a centralized government, where you have a king or ruler, where people in the surrounding territory pay tribute or taxes to that person, And the reason they're looking for this is in part because that means that wealth will be consolidated. For instance, in the city of Tenochtitlan, which is the capital of the Aztec Empire, a great serious amount of gold, silver, various other valuable pottery and ornaments and all kinds of beautiful sculptures and fantastic things were consolidated for Hernan Cortez to notice and look at and covet and desire to steal. So that's appealing for him. Also, the reason that he's looking for centralized governments is because that makes it much easier to carry out a conquest. If you can topple a government and then kind of move into its place, that's a lot easier than trying to unify a scattered group of people that all have their own local rulers and nobody answers to anybody else, and that's just a lot more difficult of a process. So, Hernan Cortez finds exactly what he's looking for in the Aztec Empire. This place in central Mexico is ideal for him in a lot of ways. It has a centralized empire already, as I mentioned. It has a king. It has a great amount of wealth that he covets and wants to have. The territory around Tenochtitlan is relatively flat. It's relatively open. It's suitable for farming. And so for all of these reasons, Hernan Cortez looks at it and thinks to himself, this seems like an ideal spot. So he pursues a policy that other conquistadors are going to emulate. He meets with the king, Montezuma. He is going to hammer out, I guess, prospective trade deals or alliance terms or whatever it is he hammers out. Whatever he promises, though, he doesn't deliver on. Once Montezuma decides to trust him and let him freely into the city, Hernan Cortez is going to stage a coup, kill the king, seize control over the city, and then use his military advantages to dominate the population first in Tenochtitlan and then elsewhere in the Aztec Empire. He's helped out by this by topical epidemic disease that he's brought with him from Europe is going to go sweeping through the Aztec Empire, seriously weakening and killing a great number of people. And while they're in the kind of peak of their disarray, that's when Cortez's soldiers, who are immune to all of the diseases they've unleashed, like influenza and smallpox and all of those wonderful things, are going to come sweeping on in and gather up the survivors and force them into a kind of new colonial government, for lack of a better word. So Hernan Cortez is going to seize the kingdom of the Aztec, and he's going to use it really brutally for his own benefit. Now, he has some serious advantages in this, as I mentioned. The Spanish who came with him are mostly soldiers, ex-soldiers, people who would like to be soldiers. They have armor. They have horses with them, which is a massive tactical advantage because horses do not exist in the New World at this point. They have guns, gunpowder weapons, and all of these things together give them a huge advantage over the Aztec. It's less of a serious advantage in other parts of North and South America. The Aztec lived in a relatively open area. It's plains land. And for that reason, it's difficult for people to run away. It's difficult for them to hide. The horses, the guns, all of this give the Spanish a huge advantage over them. If you go a little further south in Mexico, however, if you get into jungle-type areas, where, for instance, the Maya live, it's very difficult for Cortez and horse-based small armies to capitalize on heavily forested areas. It's just too easy for local people to use the terrain, to evade capture, and to strike without warning. And so, for that reason, Cortez and others are going to be looking for places like central Mexico as their kind of prime targets. The same kind of thing we saw with Cortez and Mexico is going to repeat in South America with the kingdom of the Inca. You can sort of see in this upper map here where the path that Pizarro took is. That's where he ends up in Peru. And it's the same kind of deal. It's almost exactly a replay of the Cortez situation. Pizarro is going to meet with the king of the Inca. He's going to befriend him. He's going to promise to participate in a conflict that the king of the Inca has with one of his neighbors. And then at the last minute, he's going to turn on his promised ally, stage a coup, take over, and seize the Inca Empire for himself. This is just a tried and true method that the conquistadors are going to use again and again. This bottom picture here, if you're looking at it, is, of course, a city of the ruins of Machu Picchu, which is fantastic and fabulous and one of the great treasures of the ancient world. It was an ancient city. It was abandoned before the conquistadors ever showed up. They never found it. It's high up in the Andes. If you ever have a chance to go see it, especially recently, I know recently no one's traveling, but if you do have a chance to see it in the next several years, do take that chance, because there's constant talk about closing it to visitors. So just a little heads up, see it if you can. Okay, so of course, news is traveling back from the conquistadors. They're telling everybody in Europe what's going on, and they're embroidering these stories as heavily as possible to paint themselves in the best light possible. The reality is, of course, that they are brutally conquering peoples that they encounter, many of whom are all but helpless and decimated by disease and all that kind of horrible stuff. And they're enslaving the people that they do conquer and force them into the Encomienda System, which I'll talk about in just a moment. In order to make this more palatable for their audience back in Europe, Hernán Cortez and Pizarro and Balboa and others like them are going to send back these lurid accounts of how horrible and barbaric the people they encounter are. They have all of these stories about bloody Aztec human sacrifice. It's not entirely unwarranted. The Aztec did practice some human sacrifice in a more limited way than Cortez would certainly have suggested. And certainly they mostly reserved it for the execution of war criminals and that kind of thing. Well, prisoners of war. And so in that way, they're really not any bloodier than the Europeans, but nevertheless, Cortez is going to take that and some of the traditional decorations that he finds in the Aztec Empire, and he's going to point it out as this horrible pagan idolatry, devil worship, and so therefore it's justified to do all of the horrible things that he was doing to the Aztec. It's justified for Pizarro to be doing all of the horrible things he's doing to the Inca, and for, generally speaking, Europeans to be doing all of the horrible things that they are doing to these peoples of the Caribbean, North and South America, because they are entitled, because the people are not Christian, and this is only going to benefit them in the long run if they can be converted, and so therefore it's for their own benefit to be conquered and enslaved. That's the story that Cortez wants you to believe. What he's justifying is going to be something I referred to just a moment ago, the Encomienda System. Cortez and others are going to, the other conquistadors, are going to try to set up something like a medieval farm system, but in North and South America, where they are going to grab up land and then use that land, turn it into money by planting cash crops, things that can be turned around for the maximum amount of profit back in Europe. And so for that reason, a great number of things are going to be imported, as well as local resources that are going to kind of be discovered to be exploited as well. Conquistadors are going to grab land, and then for their workforce, their goal is to grab as many native people as they possibly can and force them to work like serfs, where they're tied to the land and they can't leave, and they're effectively slaves, and they have to work on the land and do all of the farming that is going to be generating this big cash payout. That's the goal. And in order to make this work out, in order to make this as profitable as possible, there is a great amount of, I guess, goods that go back and forth. Some things that are discovered, exploited, and imported to Europe from the New World end up being enormously popular and enormously important in the economy and in the agricultural production of the Old World, of Europe and Africa and Asia, all of those places. And some of the stuff that is brought from the Old World, from Europe and Africa and Asia, are going to be massively transformative to the agriculture of the New World as well. So, for example, and I've got the list here, some of the things that were discovered by Europeans that are native to the New World include tobacco, quinine, which is a curative for malaria, very important, sweet potato, avocado, chili peppers, peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, beans, vanilla, and cocoa, as well as turkeys. So a lot of that stuff is really things that we in many ways associate with European countries. Tomatoes, it's really interesting to think that there were no tomatoes in Italy before Columbus. There were no potatoes in Ireland before Columbus. And these are going to be enormously important. The potato in particular is going to be an enormously important nutritive crop, especially in poor areas like Ireland, because it produces a lot of nutrition per square acre. We'll get back to that in a bit. Also, some of the things that we consider luxury goods that are very delicious, vanilla and cocoa, chocolate, is going to be introduced from the New World. Now, from the European side, they're going to be investing in farms, and some of the goods that they bring over to plant in the more tropical climate of South America that don't grow very well in Europe, but there's a strong sort of drive and desire to have in Europe, a great demand for them, include coffee, which is native to the Arabian Peninsula, bananas, citrus, sugarcane, that's going to end up being a huge cash crop, as well as, and this is something that they did of course have in Europe, but these are things that didn't exist in the Americas before the Columbian Exchange. Cattle, cows, horses, pigs, sheep, as well as wheat, barley, oats, and all of those things, we think of those as very traditional farm crops. It is going to transform agriculture in the New World. As well as, and this is the really nasty part, Europeans are going to import malaria, smallpox, influenza, and typhus. And between all of those, there will be a massive, you could call it an extinction event, and people don't go entirely extinct for the most part, but there is a massive, huge mortality rate among native peoples who are exposed to these diseases for the first time. And as a result of that, the Encomienda system begins to flounder. The goal was to create these big medieval-style estates and then make native people work on them as serfs/slaves. That doesn't work out very well because the native people keep dying of malaria and smallpox and influenza. And so, once native populations begin to die off, or at least struggle, the Spanish have to come up with some other way. Now, not everybody in Spain, and not everybody who was even in this first wave of people who were explorers and early settlers from the Spanish and Portuguese, approved of this kind of behavior. Very famously, you had a friar, a Dominican friar by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas. He's going to speak out very vocally in favor of the indigenous people. He's going to argue that what's being done to them with this policy of enslavement, of being attacked and having their land stolen, that this is all wrong and it's a terrible way to treat people and it shouldn't be done, and that at the very least, native people should be offered legal protections and should be considered kind of subjects of Spain in an equal way to the way that everyone else was. And there's enough pressure being put by de las Casas, among others, on the throne, on the King and Queen of Spain, that they are going to relent a bit. In 1542, they will pass something called the New Laws. And in these new laws, there's an attempt to limit some of the worst abuses of the conquistador class. There's limits on the right to enslave people. They're not allowed to. They're trying to get rid of the encomiendas. They're trying to limit the just terrible, horrible, brutal abuses of native peoples. This was a glimmering hope, I guess you could say, for the humanity and humanitarian causes of these Spanish colonists and settlers. It is not, however, destined to be long-lived. The conquistadors themselves loathe this idea. They hate it, and they complain bitterly to the King of Spain that they can't possibly make money like this, that he's throwing his opportunities away, that the Portuguese are going to end up having all of the money in the world because their trade is going to flourish and no money is going to be made on these new exploratory conquests, and what if they've invested so much, and blah, 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 blah. It goes on. So they resist, they refuse to obey the laws, and they complain so heartily that the King of Spain ultimately relents and abolishes the laws. And so the conquistadors are allowed to go unchecked. There's going to be another, I guess, obstacle as well. And this is something the King of Spain perhaps didn't quite anticipate. There's a new order a monastic order called the Jesuits. Now, I don't know if you noticed as we were moving along, we are now in the 1500s. By 1540, the Protestant Reformation is getting into full swing. Lots of people are breaking with the Catholic Church. There is a great deal of almost panic inside Catholic circles to figure out how they're going to stop this and reverse it. And one of the ways that the Catholic Church attempts to stop it is with a new monastic order known as the Jesuits. And they're led and founded by a guy named Ignatius Loyola. Let's picture him there on the left. Loyola's story is an interesting one. He was originally a soldier, and he was badly injured at one point. Breaks a femur, I believe. And he ends up in traction, lying in bed, confined to bed for weeks and weeks at a time. And while he's lying in his hospital bed, he's got nothing to do, and he only has a couple of books with him that he can read, and he just reads them over and over again. And one of them is a Life of the Saints. So it has a whole list of saints and martyrs of the Catholic Church and all the horrible ways they died. And then the other book, just for cheerfulness, is A Passion of the Christ, which, if you haven't seen the movie, is an account of the torture and death of Jesus. So he just reads these things over and over again, and then he has this kind of epiphany moment for himself. And he decides that if he survives this, if he gets out of it, if he doesn't die of infection, he's going to create a new order of warrior monks, as he sees them, but not in the sense that the Templars are warrior monks where they actually fight. Instead, he sees it as a training regimen. He's like, what we're going to do is we're going to have the best, the most persuasive people we can possibly find. People who are great public speakers, people who are highly educated, people who understand Catholic doctrine inside and out and can make a good argument for it. And we're going to train them up, not the way that monks are currently trained, but like soldiers are trained. So if you're familiar with how basic training works, if you're familiar how army training works, when you get off the bus, if you've seen movies, there's a drill sergeant that shouts at you and yells abuse, and then you're, very upset. That's the goal. The purpose of this training, if you've ever wondered why drill sergeants do that kind of thing, the purpose is to unsettle people, to make them doubt everything that they ever thought about themselves, to break their personality down. So that they can be then built back up with the skills and confidence and techniques and discipline that the army wants them to have. Well, Ignatius Loyola uses the same process to train monks. And the whole goal, his whole mission, is to train monks to convert as many people to Catholicism as he possibly can. That's the goal of the Jesuits. That's the name, the Society of Jesus. The Jesuit order is the order that is founded and approved by the Pope, and he sees it as his particular mission and his particular skill set to go all around the world. These Jesuits, people who want to join his order, are going to be dispatched everywhere as fast as they can to grab up people who are not Christian currently and try to convert them not just to Christianity in general, but to Catholic Christianity in particular. This is in a sense, a race to convert as many people as possible so that they can kind of outweigh this whole Protestant menace. And so for that reason, almost immediately after the order is approved, Jesuits begin sending missionaries all over the world. They send them to India, China, Japan, as well as the New World. They are some of the first people on the first boats that are launched out to North and South America and the Caribbean, and they send their missionaries out into the world, into the wilderness, with a particular set of skills, and as well as a series of, strategies that are instilled in these Jesuit missionaries. And these strategies differ from earlier Christian missionaries. If you were to go back a few hundred years to where Christians are attempting to spread Christianity in Europe, for instance, if you were to go back to, say, 500, 600 AD, in those cases, generally they focused on kings, trying to get them to turn into Christians on behalf of their entire people, or they would go in and, attack pagan temples and end up dying and calling themselves martyrs. The Jesuits don't do this. They have a different approach. And in this approach, the Jesuits will argue, and this is what Loyola's plan was, that the way to convince people to convert is not to show up and tell them they're terrible and horrible and devil worshippers and going to hell. Instead, you should Introduce yourself gently to a community. You should dress the way the locals dress. You should learn local languages. You should record local languages so that Jesuits who come after you can take your learning into account and more easily communicate with people. You should figure out what's important to the people that you encounter, and you should offer them something that is of value to them. So in places like China, Jesuit missionaries will approach the emperor and offer to share the latest and greatest kind of European technologies with the emperor, things like the printing press, which was more a curiosity in China because of their language difference, and hot air balloons, all kinds of things like along those lines. In places like the Americas, it's a little bit different, but I can say that it worked out extraordinarily well. The Jesuits win a lot of converts with this kind of technique, and it ends up being hugely, massively blueprint for success. Okay, in the Americas, there's an extra twist to this because you have the conquistadors, and even though they're using the non-Christianity of the peoples that they are conquering as justification for conquest and enslavement, if you remember back to what I said several slides ago, with the whole Soida thing, back when the Pope gave permission to Portugal to have exclusive rights over newly discovered lands, a precedent was set that it was okay for Europeans to capture and deal in slaves as long as those slaves are not Christian. Well, the conquistadors had been making quite a bit of use of this codicil. They'd been capturing people, enslaving them, forcing them to work on encomiendas, and when called on it, they said, well, we can do this because they're not Christian. The Jesuits understand that this is the deal. So when they go slipping into Latin America, North and South America, Central America, they immediately go running ahead of where the conquistadors are, where they're exploring, where they're consolidating control over territory. They will move into territory, like this image is from a settlement in Paraguay. They will move into territory and meet the locals. Do all of the things we already talked about, learning the local languages, dressing according to local custom, being polite to people. And while they're in the middle of doing this, they'll make a quick suggestion. They're like, hey, there's this fun blessing thing that my people do, where we dunk everybody in the river and say a little like prayer over them, and presto changeo, it's called baptism, and it will protect you from evil. And so swaths of local people decide, well, all right, fine, seems like an okay idea. And they end up baptized by the Jesuits, who then continue to talk to them about various technologies and generally be helpful and pleasant and friendly. And when the conquistadors show up outside the village and say, okay, everybody, congratulations, get in line, you're all going to be enslaved and have to come and work on my encomienda, the Jesuits will go out and say, ha ha ha, not so fast. You can't take these people from this village because they have been baptized and they are therefore Christian. And so therefore they are protected from you and your attempt to enslave them. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't work. In the cases where it does work, where the Jesuits stand in the way, and the conquistadors are now faced with the dilemma, because of course letters have been written and people are aware of the Jesuit settlement and they'd have to kill a bunch of Jesuits in order to capture these people. In many cases, what happens is the conquistadors have to back off and they have to leave this group of people alone. And having done this, having turned away these conquistadors as a result of having baptized the local population, this of course opens the door for the Jesuits. I don't mean to imply that they did this purely out of the goodness of their hearts. This opens the door for the Jesuits to win confidence among the people that they are living among, to be able to convince them to adopt Christianity fully and actually learn the catechism and all that kind of wonderful stuff, and to therefore create a small Christian community in reality, not simply be baptized in name only. It is enormously, massively irritating to the conquistadors, who complain bitterly about the Jesuits ruining their time. The same way that they complained about the new laws, they're going to rant and rave and write angry letters to the King of Spain demanding he do something about the Jesuits. Eventually, this is going to work, sadly enough. The King of Spain is going to become angry enough about Jesuit missionary activity interfering with the enslavement of people in South America that he's going to put pressure on the Pope, and the Pope is going to disband the Jesuits, even though they've been enormously successful in spreading Christianity around the world, which the Pope will claim is his goal. He's going to knuckle under to economic pressure and political pressure, and he's going to give in to the King of Spain, and he's going to declare to the Jesuits that they're no longer approved by the Pope, and they all have to kind of dissolve and go away. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, one of the major problems with enslaving local populations is not just interfering Jesuits, but another major problem with enslaving local populations is that they are enormously vulnerable to European diseases. Influenza, typhus, these are going to fly through the population and decimate them, and people are going to die in large numbers. And in order to make those encomienda work out, those plantations, those big farms that they've established, the Spanish are going to feel pressure to bring in more workers. And since they can't enslave Europeans, it's against the rules since they're all Christian, and they can't enslave the local populations very effectively because they keep dying of disease. What they do is they are going to start importing people from Africa. They're going to capture them in some cases. They're going to deal in slave trading in others in Africa in order to grab people up, load them on ships, and haul them on over to work on the Encomienda System in the New World. They're not going to be the only ones who do this, but early on it is going to start with the Spanish and Portuguese as well, importing people to work on those big cash crop plantations. And the most lucrative of those plantations are places where the working conditions are especially grueling: sugar plantations. The geographic conditions where sugarcane grows, it requires a tropical environment. You have lots of them in the Caribbean, along the coast of Brazil as well, and the coast of South America. In areas that are swampy and wet, that tends to be where sugar grows the best. It also tends to be places where malaria flourishes, where rats flourish, and all the diseases that rats carry. These are awful living conditions and awful working conditions, and this contributes to this driving need for more slaves. Sugar is enormously valuable. It sells at very high prices, both in its raw form and, well, refined form, and also in its turned into, sorry, I bobbled that for a minute there. It's also enormously valuable once it's been turned into alcohol, which is a lot of where the sugar that's being produced in the New World ends up. It's going to be fermented into rum, in some cases whiskey, but mostly rum, and then sold in that form back to Europe. So there's this enormous demand for the product. The product is enormously valuable, but working conditions for people who produce it are so poor that once you start working in the sugar plantations, your life expectancy goes down to about 5 years or so. It's dreadful. And so there's this enormous appetite to import people, more and more being dragged from Africa and being enslaved in the New World in order to make these plantations make money. Okay, so this map is going to show Portuguese and Spanish territory. The map is from about 1790, so we aren't quite that far in lecture, but it gives you a sense of where this is headed. And as you can see, the biggest chunks, sort of solid chunks of colonial territory that are being claimed are in North and South America. Now, not all of this is effectively controlled. Not all of this is effectively conquered. Even in 1790, you can see that pink area, which is claimed by Spain, but not really. There's nobody there, nor have any actual people on the ground to actually ruling this territory. In South America, that's the Amazon, and in North America, that's the Pacific Northwest. But as you can see, these tiny countries in Europe, if you see the originals over here, these tiny countries in Europe are claiming huge swaths of the world. So there's tiny, tiny Portugal. There's a little bit of Portuguese territory along the coast of Africa, a few outposts in India itself, a little bit over here in the Philippines, and then you have this massive block that is Brazil. The same goes for Spain. They're claiming enormous swaths of land. They don't effectively control all of that at once, but they do nevertheless claim dominion over it as part of their exclusive trade network, as part of territory where they can extort as much natural resource as possible. They're claiming it all. Now this right map shows some of how it's going to play out really in the long term. Spain and Portugal are not going to be the only players in this game forever. Eventually the French and the English and the Dutch are going to get in on it as well. And they also are going to end up claiming territories. And so we're going to talk a little bit next about how that happens. Okay, so the early exploratory expeditions that are sent out by France and England and the Dutch as well really happened quite a bit earlier than any attempt at actual colonization. This has to do with the fact that Spain in particular has a dominant navy. The Spanish Armada is at its height in the early to mid 1500s. They're already bringing in all kinds of money. They have the Pope's approval that says that their territory that they explore is theirs exclusively, and so the Spanish are making the most of this. They're also very politically powerful at the time in Europe. The French are struggling. They've been struggling with the wars of religion. There's all kinds of stuff going on that are really blocking the French and the English from getting in on this early on, but they do send out explorers. Jacques-Cartier is going to explore some of the northern part of North America. He's looking for a route around, the same way that Vasco da Gama was looking for a route to India, the same way that Magellan found his way around the southern bit of South America. Jacques-Cartier is looking for a northern route, is principally what he's after. He doesn't find one, but he does claim territory in Nova Scotia and St. Lawrence in 1534 or so. They don't really do a lot with it, the French, at this point, but they've got their hat in the ring. They don't actually start settling until 1608 or so, when Samuel de Champlain, there he is there, is going to create a permanent settlement in Quebec. And in order to do this, there was a lot of negotiation that was involved. Not only did they have to take advantage of the fact that this is after the defeat of the Spanish Armada that happened in 1588. The Spanish had to knuckle under. They had to allow exploration of North and South America and colonization of North and South America by countries like England and France, where they didn't have to allow it before. But interestingly enough, Samuel de Champlain is going to have to collaborate quite heavily with native peoples if he wants his economic model to work for the northern colonies. Now, I want to take a moment and emphasize the French general attitude and demeanor toward native peoples is not fundamentally different from that of the Spanish. When the French conquer islands in the Caribbean, which they do when they claim them for France, they behave exactly the same way that the Spanish do. They take these islands, they capture and enslave any native people. Once native people die of disease, they import African slaves, and they work plantations to grow sugar and various other cash crops. Exactly the way the Spanish do. So this is not, what I'm about to tell you is not indicative of any real difference of philosophy or morality, but it is a difference of circumstance. In North America, especially in the northern part of North America, it's heavily forested. It is not the kind of territory that really lends itself to invasion easily. And it also is not the kind of territory where you can grow citrus or bananas or sugar or even, as far north as Champlain was, tobacco. It's not the kind of place where you can grow a cash crop and put an encomienda system in place. So if you want to make money in this territory, there were two main avenues that the French wanted to explore. The first was fisheries, and they were deeply into that. And the second was that they were looking for the fur trade. Timber as well, but fur especially was a big cash crop moneymaker. The problem with the fur trade from the perspective of an invader, from the perspective of a colonizer, is that it is not the kind of thing that you can do with 50,000 of your closest friends. You can't just invade in force and expect to make money on the fur trade. Fur trade involves trapping wild animals. They're not that dense on the ground. And so if you're going to be successful and profitable at the fur trade, you have to have relatively few trappers moving through quite a large amount of territory, quite forested, quite not very heavily occupied territory, taking skins, trapping animals and skinning them, etc., and hopefully trading with people who can cover even more territory and even more land to gather more furs, and then pulling them all together, traveling long distances, usually up waterways, and then compiling them all into one big compile and then shipping them back to Europe. That's how you make money at it. Unfortunately, this is not the kind of thing you can use your army to defend. This is not the kind of thing you can come with thousands of people and expect to turn a profit. So the only way you can make the fur trade profitable is if you can find a way to move freely through the territory without worrying that you're going to be attacked, without worrying that you're going to be stopped by native peoples, by local peoples, and with their cooperation. That's the only real way you're going to make a living at it. And so in order to get that cooperation, Samuel de Champlain negotiates, shockingly, in relatively good faith with the peoples that he encounters, the Algonquin, the Huron in particular. He's going to negotiate treaties that he actually holds up his end of. He will send his troops to war, for instance, alongside the Algonquin against their enemies, the Iroquois in this particular case. And he will hammer out treaties that are actually fairly balanced, that provide benefits to both sides, in order that fur traders and fur trappers are able to move freely and safely in this territory and turn a profit. And so, as a result of this, the French are going to set up a relatively small population of people who settle in these trade towns like Montreal and Quebec, and a really scattered, low population density group of fur traders and trappers and ultimately timber harvesters who are going to move through this land, and they're going to work in cooperation with native populations, and they are going to mostly stick and follow alongside waterways. As a result of this, France is going to claim a lot of that corridor between the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes and then southward along the Mississippi Basin. They're going to claim kind of all of that as one huge long trade network that they use to move their goods, specifically furs. You can see here, this is an image of the sort of northeast. We're actually right in the middle of that, if you can see there. It doesn't have the hoodlum shown on there, but okay. Is the Onondagas. That's where we are. And so this territory is kind of at the crossroads. To the north is where you can kind of see the sort of blue shading. This is where French settlers are going to settle, over toward Massachusetts and Long Island. You get some English settlement. You have this yellow is New Amsterdam. This is where the Dutch early on are going to establish their colonies. The Dutch are going to come and go. We're not going to get into it too much detail. Ultimately, they'll be absorbed by the English. And then to the south, you have the English as well. So, as I mentioned before, the French start with fisheries, and those are very important and lucrative for them, especially cod fisheries north in St. Lawrence. Then they are going to turn to fur trapping and trading, and as a result, they're going to come up with a series of treaties that are actually reasonably balanced. The English model, you can see, split into two main camps. Just like with the French, early explorers are quite a bit in advance of any actual settlement. 1497, just after Columbus, Juan Caboto, he's from Venice originally, is going to be dispatched by the English to explore what's there. And he's going to move along the coast of North America, and he's going to report back along the coastline, drawing some maps and seeing what he's found. The English are not going to actually capitalize on this for quite some time, not until the Spanish Armada is defeated and they get kind of special commissions. It's the King James I is going to get permission really strongly. There's a little bit of activity under Elizabeth as well, but James I is going to get the real kind of permission to go ahead and begin serious colonization efforts. And because it is James I who gets permission to do these settlements, the earliest surviving English settlement in the Americas is a place called Jamestown, named after the King of England. And it settled in 1607 to 1608, and it was dispatched as a mercantile colony. The goal of it was to make money, and it's going to follow kind of the same pattern as we saw with the Spanish Encomienda System. But they're coming to it quite a bit later. The Spanish have already settled in a lot of areas of the Caribbean and in a lot of areas of Central and South America. And the English were in a position to watch that happen. And so when they settle in Jamestown, early on, it's very tentative. It's people who have left England. They tried to find a spot along Virginia's coast, or really anywhere that they thought might look hospitable, to stop and to settle. They find a spot, they build a little fort and a little village, and then they enter into negotiations with the local people that they find. Now, they're going to be in a kind of compromise position. They're not going to cooperate as fully as, say, the French will. In negotiating with local people. But in these early days, the English can't afford to be hostile to local populations. They are trying to make money. They are not especially interested in enslaving the people that they encounter. In North America, where John Smith and the sort of Jamestown colony are founded, population density of Native Americans is relatively low compared to, say, the Aztec Empire of central Mexico or the Inca of Peru. It's not that it's especially low, but it's low compared. And part of the reason it's a low population density is because the territory is heavily forested. It's not a conqueror's dream. And so because it's a little bit of a dicier situation, because the early colony expedition is quite small, they're in a vulnerable position and they can't afford open hostilities with the people they encounter. That's probably what happened to Roanoke, the disappearing colony. And so they decide that they're going to come up with kind of a compromise position. They try to negotiate with the peoples that they find locally. Famously, this is going to be reported back in England in John Smith's account of Jamestown's foundation. He's going to describe meeting the local people, the local leader, a guy named Powhatan, and particularly Powhatan's daughter, who's going to be captured at one point by the Jamestown colonists, and then is ultimately going to marry one of them, John Rolfe, and is going to be kind of brought back to Europe to be shown off as what is possible with the civilized savage. That's their words, not mine. Her life is going to be highly, highly romanticized in a variety of different versions. It probably wasn't nearly as fun as we might think, but what she really represents is that there was this negotiation between the settlers in Jamestown and the local people who lived there. And they come up with an understanding. The settlers will be allowed to claim some land, establish farms. They were introduced to a crop, tobacco, that they're going to use and grow and sell it back in Europe at a tremendous profit. And they're not going to enslave the local populations. Instead, they're going to just kind of hopscotch right over that process of the Spanish Encomienda System and just go straight to importing people right from Africa. The slave trade was already established. They didn't really see any profit in doing it any other way. And so they begin importing slaves. The English are also going to heavily use indentured servants. And we'll talk about some of that in just a bit as well. But people interested in making money, making their fortune, are going to move to colonies like this as a way to have an adventure and see if they can improve their lot in life and become rich. That's the goal. So they have colonies like that. One of the things that England is going to pursue is going to be a agricultural-based settler colonies are, of course, not the only thing that the English are looking for as they establish claims on territory in the New World as they saw it. One of the driving goals that they have in the 1600s is to try to find a route, some way to get around this very inconvenient continent and find their original goal, a way to get to China and India in order to establish a new link with their old trade partners, or at least their indirect trade partners. So they're trying to find a passage, a northwest passage as it comes to be known, to try to find a way through. Henry Hudson was one of the people who was dispatched to search for this route. And he, unfortunately, he has a couple of voyages. In 1609, he explores the Hudson River. That doesn't end up going anywhere. And comes out of that and goes back home. And then, unfortunately, in 1610, he's sent out again. And this time, he ends up in Hudson Bay. And it was so promising. Imagine what that looked like. I mean, it's freezing cold, but it's this huge. Hudson Bay is enormous. It really must look like this must be the way to the Pacific. And so he begins exploring Hudson Bay, but the weather starts to turn. It's getting colder and colder. his crew begins to panic. They're like, we can't keep doing this. We can't keep exploring in this direction. We're going to get frozen in. We have to get out of here. We have to return to England. Henry Hudson doesn't want to do that because he's like, no, we're just on the cusp of it. I know we're going to find the route through. We're going to find a way to get south and end up, you know, along the coast of what we now know as California, and it's going to be great, and we're going to find a route to China, and it's going to be fantastic. I'm going to be a hero. We're going on. So his crew goes along with him for a while. Eventually, it's getting colder and colder. There's polar bears everywhere. They're afraid the sea is going to utterly freeze, and they're going to be trapped, and they're all going to freeze to death and die. So they mutiny. And they tell Henry Hudson that they're not going any further, and if he insists on it as the captain, too bad, so sad, we're going home without you. And so they chuck him into a lifeboat. It was a good-sized lifeboat, with his son and a few other people who were loyal to him, and they abandon him in Hudson Bay, and they turn around and they go back to England, where for a while they pretend like that's not what happened, but eventually the story comes out and everybody gets caught, and the whole thing is unfurled. Now this artistic piece on the left there takes some liberties. Henry Hudson's son, when he was put in the lifeboat, was like 19, so they decided to depict him as a child for pathos, I guess. But at any rate, Henry Hudson is abandoned. He's never found. No one knows exactly what happened to him, but he is certainly dead by now. At any rate, the attempt to find a Northwest Passage utterly fails. They search and search and search and can't find one. And so the English kind of have to reevaluate what it is they're going to do to try to capitalize on the opportunity to colonize this territory. So what happens is that the English are going to set up kind of these piecemeal colonies. They have a variety of goals. They have a variety of approaches. The earliest, like Jamestown, are set up just as sort of like the Spanish encomiendas. They establish big plantations. They grow cash crops for profit back in the old world. They're going to engage in a kind of heavy trade back and forth between themselves and their home country. And they're going to have as their primary goal making money. So they're setting up big farm plantations in order to make money. There are other colonies that will be set up in the next century or so as well. Georgia, for instance, will be established as a penal colony, a prison colony, so that all of the prisoners in England that are just, like eating up food and causing problems, people who'd committed crimes that aren't bad enough to be executed for instance, were loaded onto boats and shipped over to Georgia and just kind of dumped there. They do the same thing with Australia once they've captured that as well. It's also going to be used as a dumping ground for criminals. And when I say criminals, I should emphasize these are people who have not committed a crime bad enough to be executed for, and the bar for that was fairly low. So we're talking about petty thieves, tax evaders, debtors, for instance. We're not talking about people who are like violent criminals because they just would have been executed. At any rate, they have people, some of these are penal colonies, places to dump those who they don't want in England anymore. Some of them are farm colonies, agricultural cash colonies. Some in the north are trying to establish kind of rival places where they can be fur traders like the French, although the French have that pretty well buttoned up. And some, like the Massachusetts Bay Colony, are founded by religious separatists. This was another problem, a tension they had in England, the constant conflict between Protestant and Catholic. And complicating that conflict was the fact that the Protestants didn't necessarily agree amongst themselves. There were soft Protestants, Anglicans, that agreed with Henry VIII, Elizabeth, James I, that, maybe we can be Protestant and read the Bible and stuff, but we're not going hardcore Puritan. And then you had hardcore Puritans who wanted to see serious religious change. And they also wanted to be, like John Calvin, a part of a community that set up their leadership as the leadership of the church and the leadership of the community all in one. They wanted to create a fabulous, new, idyllic society for the elect. And they saw this new world as a chance to do that. And so they petitioned for the right to create a colony, not principally for the purpose of making money, though they do intend to support themselves, but they want to create a colony principally as a place to settle. So it's a religious separatist settler colony. And this is different because unlike with either the, I guess, mercantile colonies of the north, or the French fur trapper colonies, or even the Spanish Encomienda, they're not going to be leaving England with mostly men looking to make their fortunes. Instead, it's going to be leaving England with the entire community. Wives and children, whole families, everybody's going all in one. So it's a whole community picking up and moving to a new place. And so the most famous of these, the earliest of them, is the Plymouth Colony. It's Puritans, they're Calvinists, very rigorous, they believe in the whole elect thing, and they're going to be given a charter and allowed to form a colony in the New World. They sail on the Mayflower, they land in 1620, they establish a new governor and try to create this kind of new experiment in, I guess, fabulous Puritan governance. I want to emphasize, they may have left England for the freedom to pursue their own religion. They do not believe in religious freedom. You are not allowed to be something other than a Puritan if you want to live in Plymouth Colony. This is interesting and important because of Calvinist ideas toward conversion and attempts to bringing people into the fold. Unlike the Jesuits and the Catholics, the religious separatist colonies are not deeply invested in trying to convert native peoples as they encounter them. We're all probably fairly familiar with some of the Thanksgiving stories, the sort of pilgrims and the native peoples they encounter. It's certainly, there is some truth to that the first winter, at least where the Plymouth Colony founded and itself and settled, they would almost certainly have died if local people had not been friendly to them and had not helped them out and brought them food and generally kept them from starving to death. But here's the interesting thing. The Plymouth Colony people are not interested in enslaving the locals. That's a plus. They're not really interested in bringing slaves over from Africa. They will do that to some extent, but not nearly the same kind of way that they do further south in Virginia, where the plantations are being set up. They are really interested in setting up their own little community for like-minded people like themselves. And so on the surface, and in the early days, this seems like it would be a relatively positive interaction with local peoples, and it sort of is. But later on, as the colony grows, as their numbers increase, what they want is more and more land. And what they don't want is to share that land with anybody else. So there's this kind of, I guess it's not really a debate among historians who more or less agree, but there had been a debate in historical tradition, let's say a century or two ago, that went on for some time, over who was the worst, the most monstrous, when it came down to brutalization of basically their colonists against native peoples in the Americas. And the English will maintain that the Spanish are the worst people ever because of the whole enslavement of natives and importation of Africans and the general horrible Encomienda System and all their terrible slavery and terrible cruelty. The Spanish will maintain that the English are the worst people ever because even though they don't intend to enslave native peoples, the minute they get strong enough to do so, numerous enough to do so, what they do is they push native peoples off their land, and if the native peoples won't go, they kill them. So it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. You have one side that is bent on the enslavement of an entire group of people. On the other side, you have people who really have no use in those people who are native to this country existing at all. So 6 one, half dozen the other. They're both pretty horrible. Okay, so what you see here on the map are the various claims by 1700 or so of Britain, France, and Spain. The Spanish do claim a bit more in the western part of what is now the United States and is shown on the map, but they don't effectively have much of a presence there. New France, this green territory in the middle, is enormous, at least in part, because they're using really extended trade networks. They don't have a ton of people or any kind of serious permanent settlements in a lot of that green area. Instead, they're using this primarily as places where they have alliances and places where they have understandings and places where they have trade deals with native people in order to further the fur trade. The British, of course, are mostly focused on sedentary farm-based colonies, some of them religious separatists, some of them out to make money, some of them penal colonies. It's all just sort of varies. And the Spanish, of course, are focusing on their encomienda style farm-based commercial colonies where they're trying to make as much money as possible. Yeah, so that's it. I guess we're at the end. So thanks for listening.